Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Wyatt again, and today we are looking at section 3 of topic 6. We're working with percents throughout this entire topic. Yesterday, we were talking about fractions, decimals, and percents, how they relate to each other, and how to convert between the different forms of those. Today, though, we're doing the same thing, but we're looking at some special percents today. We're looking at ones that are greater than 100% or less than 1%. So these are really unusual ones. And some of you might be thinking, but I thought 100% was everything. How could you have a percent that's greater than 100? Well, you can, and I'll show you that here in this example. Marcy, Bobby, and Max began their homework at the same time. Marcy finished her homework in 60 minutes. Bobby finished his homework in 50% of the time it took Marcy to finish. Max finished his homework in 150% of Marcy's time. How long did each of them work? So Marcy is considered the standard here, and it says that Marcy took 60 minutes to complete her homework. Okay, now that's considered 100% of her time to complete the assignment. Now, Bobby was faster. In fact, it says Bobby took 50% as much time as it took Marcy to complete the assignment. Now, you might be thinking, "Oh, I know what 50% of 60 minutes is. That would be 30 minutes." Well, I want you to think about how you knew that. Well, you probably recognize that 50% means the same thing as 1/2 when you express it as a fraction. And it does. It technically means percent means per 100, so it technically means 50 out of 100. But when you simplify that, that equals 1/2. And it also, in decimal form, would be the same thing as 0.5. How do I know that? Well, you might just know it. But 50%, you can change any percent into a decimal if you take the decimal point and move it left 2 spaces. Since we have no decimal point shown in this percent, it must be at the end of the number. And then when we move 2 spaces to the left, we get 0.50, which is simply 0.5 or 5/10. Okay, so that's how 50% would look as a fraction and as a decimal. By the way, 100% as a fraction would be 100 over 100. And if you divide that, you get 1 whole, don't you? So it's kind of weird if I were to ask what's 100% as a fraction? It's just 1 whole. You could say 1 over 1 if you want to. That'd be fine. And as a decimal, if you take your 100% and move the decimal point left 2 spaces, you get 1.00 or 1 again. So it's kind of interesting with 100% because whether you write it as a fraction or as a decimal, it's just 1 whole. You have 1 over 1 technically, and you have 1.00 technically, but they're just 1 whole. Now we still need to talk about Max. Max, as his name suggests, took the max amount of time to finish this assignment. He finished the assignment in 150% of Marcy's time. So how long did each of them work? Well, you could take 100%, which is Marcy's time, 50%, which is Bobby's time, combine them to get 150%, just add 30 and 60 minutes together, and we would know then that Max took 90 minutes to complete the assignment. But what's more important to me today is, can you rewrite 150% as a fraction, and can you rewrite it in decimal form? Well, as a fraction, 150% means 150. My lights just turned out of 100, because that's what percent means. It means per 100. And then you can simplify this if you divide these both by 50, and you would get 3 over 2. So in fractional form, 150% is 3/2. Now you can go a step farther and divide 3 by 2 to change this into a mixed number. And you would end up getting 1 and 1/2, right? 1 times 2 is 2, remainder is 1. and then you put the remainder over the divisor. So 1 1/2 is also, well, that's technically the fractional form of 150% if you were to write it as a mixed number. Now, the decimal, getting it as a decimal is the easy part because you just take your decimal point and move it left 2 spaces. It is not shown, so the decimal point must be at the end of the number, and if you move 2 spaces to the left, you get 1.50. And again, if there is a 0 at the end of your decimals, we don't have to show it. Woo! We can just write 1 5/10. And that's 150% in decimal form. All right, let's look at another example. We have Jan and we have Kim. They built model cars for a science project. Kim's car traveled 140% as far as Jan's car. How can you write 140% as a fraction and as a decimal? You can see that in the graphic here. Jan has the blue car here, and Jan traveled 100% of the distance that Jan traveled. Well, of course. Now, Kim's car kept going. It went that entire distance Jan's car went, and then just kept on going. Must be that fancy racing stripe there, because we all know racing stripes make cars faster. Anyway, 140%, how would I write that? As a fraction. Well, as a fraction, we know percent means per 100. So I could simply write 140 out of 100. And then it's just a matter of simplifying this. And can you think of a number that goes into both 140 and 100? Most people would right away recognize, well, 10, I could divide these both by 10. They both end in a 0, so I know they're both divisible by 10. So we're going to do that. Some of you might be thinking, oh, Mr. Wyatt, you could save time, though, if you just realized you could divide them both by 20. And that's true. So if you recognize that 20 was the greatest common factor, go ahead and do that. But we're gonna do this because I think this is what most people would recognize right away. 140 divided by 10 is 14. Over 100 divided by 10, which is 10. And I'm noticing I'm not done simplifying here because these are both even values. I can divide these both by 2. Remember when you're dividing the top and the bottom by the same value? Like here, we're dividing by 2 and we're dividing here by 2. We're really dividing this by 2 halves, and that's 1 whole, isn't it? And we did the same thing up here when we divided by 10/10. We were dividing by 1 whole, technically. And when you divide by 1, are you changing its value? No, its value stays the same. You're just changing its form. Anyway, 14 divided by 2 is 7. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So as a fraction, 140% is 7/5. Now, again, you can divide this and change it into a mixed number, and it would be 1 2/5 as a mixed number. And that's quite lovely. Now, that's the tricky part, actually, writing it as a fraction. Writing it in decimal form is the easy part. And let me explain. Again, to change a percent into a decimal, just move the decimal point left 2 spaces. I have 140%. I don't see a decimal point, so where must it be? If it isn't shown, it must be at the end of the number. So then we just move the decimal point left 2 spaces. 1, 2, and we get 1.40 for our decimal form. And again, we have a 0 at the end here in our decimals, so we don't need to show that. We can just write 1 4/10. So there I wrote it as a fraction, improper, and as a mixed number, and I wrote it as a decimal, in decimal form as well. Okay? All right, so write 1/2% as a fraction and as a decimal. 1/2% is kind of an interesting one, isn't it? 1/2 of 1% is tiny. Here I have a grid that shows 100 squares. Each square represents 1% or 1 out of 100 of this whole grid. 1/2% would only be half of one of those squares. So if you think about this for a little bit, how many of those little yellow sections would fit in this entire grid? Well, you might notice that 2 of them would fit in this one little square. And if there are 100 squares, you could take 2 times 100 and you'd find out there are 200 of them that could fit in this grid. So thinking of it like that, wouldn't 1/2% as a fraction be 1 out of 200? Logically, it seems like it should be 1 out of 200. So let's find out if it really is. Some of you might be thinking, I don't know that that really made sense to me, Mr. Wyatt. Well, that's okay. We're going to do this another way. We have 1/2 of 1%. If we're going to write it as a fraction, don't get confused. Sometimes people see this and they say, oh, it's already a fraction. See? Yeah, but it's a percent. See the percent sign here? Percent means per 100. So it's really 1/2 out of 100. Well, what does the fraction bar mean? It means divide, doesn't it? This really means 1/2. Man, I'm having troubles here. It's messy. Come on. Close that out there. Get that out of there. It's really 1/2 divided by 100, or 100 over 1. To divide by a fraction, don't you multiply by its reciprocal? We did that in an earlier chapter. So we have 1/2 times 1 over 100. Well, guess what you get here? 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 100 is 200. So we do get 1 out of 200 here. Another way you could do this is if you recognized, well, isn't 1/2 0.5? Doesn't this really mean the same thing as 0.5%? And it does. And you can write this as 0.5 out of 100 then, because percent means out of 100. And then a person might say, well, do I want a decimal inside of my fraction? And the answer there is no, we don't. So there are a couple of ways we could clear this out. I could clear this out by multiplying this by 2, because then I'd get 1 here. Or I could multiply these both by 10. Because when you multiply by 10, that decimal point moves over a space and we get 5 out of 1,000. And then you could simplify this by dividing these both by 5. And you'd get 1 out of 200 then, when you simplify it. So I hope that didn't confuse you, showing you 3 different ways of looking at this problem. It is 1 out of 200. Now, if you want to write this as a decimal, this actually is where writing this 0.5% here is a really, really, really important step. 1/2% is the same thing as 0.5%. Because now, to change a percent to a decimal, we just move the decimal point left 2 spaces. And here's my decimal point. If I move it left 2 spaces, I do have to fill these spaces here with zeros, but I get 0.005. I should put a 0 in front of that as well. So 0.005, there it is in decimal form. All right, I'm going to try to do one more example here. I am running low on time. If I have 0.9% of this solution being water, the rest of it is something else. 0.9 of the solution is water. Think of it like this. Here's 1% right here. Look how almost all of it is filled orange, but not quite all of it. It's 0.9 of 1%. As a fraction and as the decimal, let's do the easy one first. As a decimal, just take your 0.9, move that decimal point left 2 spaces, and we get 0.009. Honestly, once you have the decimal, you could go from the decimal into a fractional form if you recognize what place the 9 is in. I said 0.009, but shouldn't I really read this 9 thousandths because it's in the thousandths place? I can. And then I just have 9 over 1,000 for my fraction. Isn't that nice? Or you could write 0.9 over 100 because percent means per 100, and then just multiply these both by 10, which would give you 9 over 1,000 as well. All right, so good luck on your assignment today. I will see you tomorrow.